There are moments in life when the whole weight of your years seems to press down on you in a single breath. For me, it wasn't an accident on the highway or a hospital phone call. It was a sentence, only 7 words, delivered in the sharp, careless tone of a woman who had married my son. "You're nothing but a walking ATM, Frank." The words arrived on a Sunday afternoon, in the kitchen of the very house I had been quietly paying off for 5 years. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and roast chicken. Sunlight slanted across the hardwood floors I had chosen, back when the house was only blueprints and bare beams. I stood there, hands still holding a grocery bag of things I had picked up on the way: paper towels, milk, a jar of strawberry jam because my grandson liked it. I wasn't angry, not at first. Anger is too fast, too loud. What I felt was slower, heavier, like someone had turned a key in a lock deep inside my chest and shut me out of my own family. My son Daniel didn't say a word. He was leaning against the counter, arms folded, eyes darting anywhere but mine. His silence was worse than her cruelty. Silence always is. It suggests agreement. It suggests shame. And maybe, most of all, it suggests a man too afraid to protect his own father. I set the bag down carefully, one item at a time, as if those small motions could steady me. But the sentence lingered, clanging in my head. A walking ATM. Not a father. Not a man who held his boy through a fevered night. Not the guy who worked weekends pouring concrete so college tuition wouldn't crush him. Just a machine with legs and a wallet. I thought of Daniel as a little boy, hair sticking up like a dandelion after a nap, pressing quarters into my palm and saying, "Here, Dad, now you can buy something too." Back then he believed money was magic and love was free. Somewhere along the way those beliefs had traded places. I could have shouted. I could have reminded them of the mortgage payments, $2,800 each month, withdrawn from my account without a peep. I could have listed the upgrades, the granite counters, the fancy mixer, the curtains imported from Italy. But to what end? People who call you an ATM have already done the math. They know the numbers. They just don't care about the cost. So instead I looked at my son's wife. She was beautiful in that glossy magazine way that suggests polish more than warmth. Her nails clicked against the countertop as she checked her phone. She didn't even wait for me to answer. She had said her line, closed the case. The chicken on the stove hissed as fat dripped into the pan, a small, ordinary sound. But to me it was a reminder: life keeps cooking even when hearts break. I walked out to the porch and sat on the swing I had built myself. The wood was weather-worn, the chains a little squeaky, but it still held. I rocked back and forth slowly, staring at the neat lawn, the trimmed hedges. All of it was evidence of my labor, my care, my stubborn pride. And yet I had just been told it meant nothing. People think betrayal is always a grand act: affairs, lies, theft. But sometimes it's as simple as the way a voice dismisses your entire existence. My betrayal was 7 words long. As the sun dipped lower, I felt the tug of memory. My late wife, Margaret, used to say, "Respect is the only currency that never loses value." She was right. I had been paying in dollars, in checks and transfers, but the balance of respect had run dry. Inside the house, laughter bubbled faintly from the kitchen. I wondered if they even realized I had slipped away, or if I had already become invisible long before this afternoon. I thought about Christmas, about the big tree they always liked to set up by the window, the kind you could see glowing from the street. Would they want me there this year? Or would my presence ruin the atmosphere? As Isabella liked to put it, I already knew the answer. I closed my eyes and listened to the rustle of leaves. The swing creaked steady, almost like a heartbeat. For the first time, I let myself imagine what life would look like if I stopped paying, if I let the account rest, if I pulled the plug on being their machine. It wasn't vengeance that stirred in me, not yet. It was survival, the kind that whispers, "You have given enough." The kind that reminds you that dignity, once lost, is harder to buy back than any house. When I finally rose from the swing, the evening had cooled. The porch light blinked on, automatic, washing me in pale yellow. I picked up the grocery bag I had left by the door. The milk would spoil if I didn't take it home. I left without saying goodbye. The bag felt lighter in my hand, though my chest carried a weight I could not name. That night, in my own quiet kitchen, I placed the jar of strawberry jam on the shelf. I imagined my grandson spreading it on toast the next morning. Would he ask where it came from? Would anyone tell him? I didn't know. What I did know was that something had shifted. A door had closed, not with a slam but with the soft finality of truth. I was not a father in their eyes. I was a walking ATM. And if that was the role they cast me in, then I would do the one thing no machine ever could. I would decide for myself when to stop. The first house I ever bought wasn't for me. It was for Daniel. That might sound foolish, maybe even irresponsible, but every nail I hammered in this life has been with him in mind. Fathers of my generation didn't talk much about feelings. We showed them in beams and bricks, in bills paid without complaint. I remember the day he first told me he and Isabella wanted to start a family. We were sitting in the bleachers at his old high school, watching a charity baseball game. He looked so nervous, twisting his cap in his hands. "Dad, we found a place," he said like he was confessing a crime. "It's a little out of our budget, but it's perfect." I saw the way his eyes lit up, the way Margaret's used to when she spotted a bargain at the Sunday market. Hope has a certain shine that no mortgage broker can dull. I told him, "If it's right for you, then we'll figure it out." That's what parents do. We figure it out. So I signed where the bank told me to sign. I arranged the auto transfer so he wouldn't have to think about deadlines. I even adjusted my work schedule back then, picking up side jobs, pouring concrete on weekends and patching driveways for neighbors who'd slip me $20 bills and a grateful smile. My knees ached, my back stiffened, but the thought of my son holding keys to his own home made it worth every twinge. The house itself wasn't extraordinary. A two-story colonial with white siding and black shutters, the kind you see lining suburban streets across America. But in Daniel's voice, it became more than lumber and paint. It became the start of a legacy. He pointed out where the crib would go, how the backyard would be perfect for a swing set. I nodded, pretending I could see the laughter already floating in the air. When construction dragged and costs ballooned, as they always do, I was there. "Just a little over budget," the contractor said, and I pulled out my checkbook. When Isabella wanted the hardwood imported from Brazil instead of standard oak, I swallowed the price tag and made it happen. When Daniel mentioned stainless steel appliances were the modern touch, I nodded, even though I'd cooked for decades on an old white stove that rattled when you shut the oven door. Piece by piece, dollar by dollar, I built that house for them. My name wasn't on the welcome mat, but it was on every receipt. I never bragged, never reminded them of the running tally. That's not what fathers do. We let the love speak through the walls. There were evenings when I would stop by after work just to check on the place. The smell of fresh paint clung to the air and my boots left faint prints on the dust of unfinished floors. Sometimes I would stand in the half-built nursery, picturing a rocking chair in the corner. Margaret would have loved that room. She would have sat there for hours, humming lullabies, reminding me in her gentle way that all sacrifice is a kind of prayer. Daniel never asked outright for help. He didn't have to. His voice carried that edge of embarrassment whenever money came up, but I always offered before he could. "Don't worry about it, son," I'd say, waving away his half-formed protest. He wanted to be independent, and I wanted him to feel that way, even as I slipped another check under the table. It wasn't just the big things, either. It was the curtains Isabella wanted to match her Pinterest board. The oversized mixer she swore would make her the envy of every bake sale. The landscaping bill after they decided the hedges just didn't give the right impression. Each time I told myself it was a small thing, hardly worth arguing over. A father's wallet becomes elastic when stretched by love. But love, I have learned, should never erase respect. There's a photograph I keep in a drawer at home. It was taken the day Daniel and Isabella moved in. The sun was high and everyone was sweaty from hauling boxes. Daniel's arm was looped around my shoulder and he grinned like he had conquered the world. I wasn't smiling as wide. The camera caught me mid-laugh, but if you look closely, you can see a glimmer in my eyes. It was pride, pure and unfiltered. Not in the house itself, but in the man I believed my son was becoming. Looking back now, I can still feel the weight of that day. The heavy box in my hands and the heavier hope in my chest. I had no idea that years later, in that very kitchen, the woman I helped settle under that roof would strip my roll down to a cash dispenser. No idea that my sacrifices, once invisible in the best way, would become invisible in the worst. I suppose that's the cruel trick of sacrifice. Done right, it disappears. Nobody notices the bill paid on time or the pipe quietly fixed before it burst. They only notice when the flow stops, when the transfer halts, when the man who bent himself into silence finally straightens his back. But in those early years, I wasn't thinking of tricks or betrayals. I was thinking of lineage, of building a bridge from my rough beginnings to my son's smoother tomorrow. I was thinking of Margaret's voice, urging me to make his life easier than ours had been. And so I poured not only money but decades of labor and hope into a house that would never be mine. And for a while, that felt like enough. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing people rarely understand about family fractures. They imagine some explosion, a slammed door, a shouted curse, the kind of moment you can mark on a calendar. But more often, it's a slow eroding. A trickle through the foundation until one day the house tilts and you realize the walls you trusted have been leaning for years. I began to notice it at the dinner table. At first, it was subtle. Isabella would smile too brightly when neighbors came over, laugh just a little too loudly at their jokes, as though she were auditioning for a part she already believed she deserved. She had a way of lifting her chin whenever someone mentioned her family, the Carlyles from the north side of town, known for their country club membership and holiday galas. "We've always valued refinement," she'd say, as if refinement were something you inherited like blue eyes. Daniel, sitting beside her, would nod politely but never add much. He had grown quieter since marrying her. The boy who once filled car rides with chatter about baseball stats and college dreams now measured his words carefully, as if every sentence needed approval before release. When it was just the three of us, Daniel, Isabella, and me, the tone shifted. The warmth cooled like a fire left to die in the grate. Isabella would glance at me when money came up, and Daniel's shoulders would tighten. They never asked directly, but their questions came wrapped in polite phrasing. "Do you think the bank transfer cleared, Frank?" Or, "It's wonderful we don't have to worry about the bills, isn't it?" It wasn't conversation. It was a script rehearsed and delivered without a hint of gratitude. I didn't mind carrying weight. Fathers are built for that. But what gnawed at me was the double life of their manners. In public, they paraded as gracious hosts, toasting to family and tradition. Behind closed doors, I was an afterthought, tolerated for the checks I signed, not for the man I was. The worst moments came in front of my grandson, a bright boy with a head of curls and eyes too large for his small face. He tugged my sleeve, asking if I could read him a story or build Lego towers. And just as I'd begin, Isabella would swoop in. "Not now, honey," she'd tell him, as if my presence were a distraction rather than a gift. The boy would lower his eyes, confused, then shuffle off toward the glowing television. I told myself not to take it personally. Children are resilient, and perhaps she meant well. But each time I felt another brick loosen in the wall between us, I found my refuge on the porch. After dinners, I'd step outside with a cup of coffee and listen to the low hum of crickets. From there, I could hear the murmur of voices through the window, Isabella's laughter, Daniel's softer replies. Sometimes I'd catch a phrase, "We need to think about appearances," or "Dad's old-fashioned." Words not meant for my ears, but loud enough to carry. Margaret used to say that truth always slips through the cracks, no matter how carefully people plaster over them. She was right. The truth I heard in those whispers was that I had become a burden disguised as benefactor. My money was welcome, my presence was not. It's a peculiar loneliness, being surrounded by family yet treated like a stranger. At gatherings, they'd seat me at the far end of the table, as though I were a distant uncle rather than the man who built the roof over their heads. The conversation would flow around me, trips planned, clubs joined, promotions celebrated, and when I tried to add a word, the room would politely smile before steering back to safer shores. Daniel never corrected them. He never said, "This is my father, he belongs here." His silence grew heavier than any insult. It was the silence of a man torn between loyalty and fear was winning. There was one evening late summer when it became impossible to ignore. A neighborhood couple had come over, friends of Isabella's parents. The wine flowed freely, laughter bubbled, and I sat listening as they praised the home. "Exquisite taste," they said, admiring the curtains, the granite counters, the chandelier above the dining room. Isabella preened under their compliments. Daniel smiled faintly, and then one of them asked, "How did you manage such a beautiful place so young?" For a moment there was a silence, the kind that reveals more than any words. Then Isabella answered smoothly, "We've worked hard, of course, sacrificed a lot, it's all about priorities." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. I looked at my son, waiting for him to add something, anything, a nod in my direction, a simple acknowledgement, but he just raised his glass and clinked it against theirs. That was the night I understood. Gratitude had left the house, and respect had gone with it. What remained was performance, a family that wore masks at dinner parties and shed them in the kitchen, where words like ATM waited to fall. I cleared my plate quietly, stacked the dishes, and offered to wash them. Isabella thanked me absently, already lost in conversation about an upcoming charity ball. Daniel kissed her cheek, proud to be at her side, and I stood at the sink, hands deep in soap and water, wondering when exactly my role had shifted from father to servant. The suds clung to my skin long after the plates were clean. I dried my hands on a towel and glanced at the family portrait hanging on the wall. Daniel in the center, Isabella at his side, their boy perched on his lap. I was off to the corner, slightly out of focus, like an afterthought. Perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps they had already written me out of the frame. The first snow of December fell in thin, fragile flakes, clinging to the windshield as I drove across town. I'd always loved the season, the crisp air, the quiet streets lit by strings of colored bulbs, the way a house glowed warmer in contrast to the cold. Christmas had been Margaret's favorite time of year. She filled the house with cinnamon and pine, stitched stockings by hand, and insisted every ornament had a story. Even after she passed, I tried to keep the rituals alive for Daniel's sake. It felt like a duty, yes, but also like a tether to the woman we had both loved. That year, I imagined the tradition would continue. I pictured myself at their dining room table, carving the ham, pouring cider into mugs, reading The Night Before Christmas to my grandson before bed. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that no matter how strained things had become, Christmas would be the one place they couldn't push me aside. Holidays, after all, are supposed to be about family. I was wrong. The call came one evening as I was stringing a few lights around my porch. Daniel's voice on the other end was careful, practiced. "Dad," he began, clearing his throat, "listen, about Christmas this year." He paused long enough for the silence to answer for him. I felt the bulb in my hand grow warm as it flickered. "What about it?" I asked, though I already knew. Isabella's voice floated faintly in the background. She wasn't whispering, she wanted me to hear. "It's just not the right atmosphere, Daniel. We can't have him there, it changes everything." Daniel hesitated, then spoke the words himself. "We think it might be better if you sat this one out, just this year. The guest list is different, we're trying to keep things elegant." Elegant, a word that should have meant grace and warmth, but instead felt like a slammed door. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "You mean I shouldn't come?" "It's not like that," he rushed. "It's just, we'll celebrate another time, maybe after the new year, just us." Behind him, Isabella laughed at something I couldn't make out. The sound was light, carefree, the kind of laugh a person gives when they've already won. I let the silence stretch. Snow tapped lightly against the window, and for the first time in years the house felt colder than the night outside. "All right," I finally said. "I understand. I don't remember hanging up. My body did it on its own, like muscle memory. My mind was elsewhere, wandering through Christmases past, when Daniel would shake me awake before dawn, shouting about presents, Margaret in her robe smiling at the chaos. Those mornings had been messy and loud and imperfect, and they had been mine. I sat for a long while in the living room, the string of half-lit bulbs tangled at my feet. The tree stood in the corner, undecorated. I hadn't bothered that year, thinking I'd be spending the day at their place. Now it loomed like a reminder of absence, its branches bare and reaching. It wasn't just about missing a meal. It was about being told bluntly, unmistakably, that I no longer belonged, that my presence was a blemish on their picture-perfect tableau. They wanted to host, to impress, to bask in compliments, and I did not fit the frame. I thought about my grandson. Would he notice my chair empty? Would he ask where Grandpa was? And what story would they tell him? That I was busy, that I'd chosen not to come. Lies always find their way into children's ears, shaping memories they never asked for. The days that followed were heavy with small humiliations. Neighbors asked if I was excited for the holiday, if I'd be spending it with Daniel and his family. I nodded, forced a smile, and changed the subject. Pride kept me from telling the truth. I couldn't bear the pity in their eyes. On Christmas Eve, I drove past their street. The house blazed with lights, every window glowing gold. Cars lined the curb, guests spilling laughter onto the snowy walk. Through the front window, I caught a glimpse of the tree, tall, glittering, crowded with ornaments I'd paid for but had never been asked to hang. I sat in my truck for a long time, engine idling, watching shadows move across the curtains. The laughter rose and fell, muffled but unmistakable. They were celebrating in the warmth, and I was parked in the dark, an outsider looking in on my own family. I thought of Margaret again, how she used to press her hand to mine when we walked into a room, her way of saying, "You belong here." I had not realized how much I missed that assurance until it was gone. Eventually I drove home, the tires crunching over fresh snow. Inside my house, I heated a bowl of soup, lit a single candle, and sat at the kitchen table. The chair across from me was empty, as it had been for years since she passed. Now it felt emptier still. That was the night I stopped pretending. Pretending that money could buy me a place at the table. Pretending that silence was enough to hold a family together. Pretending that love could survive without respect. And though I didn't know it yet, it was also the night the idea first took root, the notion that perhaps the only way to be seen was to step back, to stop fueling the very life that erased me. The morning after Christmas, the world outside was quiet, blanketed by a heavy snow that had fallen through the night. My street looked untouched, every roofline softened, the mailboxes capped in white. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The candle from the night before had burned itself down, leaving only a stub of wax hardened against the dish. In the stillness, the choice I had been circling for months finally settled inside me like a stone. I could feel its weight in my chest, a certainty both terrifying and liberating. I would stop paying. The words had been building since the first time Isabella slipped her disdain into casual remarks, since Daniel chose silence over loyalty, since the call that told me I was not welcome at Christmas. They had turned me into something less than a man, less even than a father. I was an account number, a transfer, a monthly lifeline they no longer respected. I opened the drawer beside me and pulled out a thin folder where I kept bank records. The numbers marched in neat rows, month after month, year after year. $2, 800, every 30 days like clockwork. By now, the total was staggering. Enough to buy my own small house outright, enough to take trips I had promised Margaret we'd one day take but never did. Instead, the money had flowed into someone else's dream, a dream that shut its door on me when the holidays came. I ran my finger down the list of payments, each one a quiet vow I had made and kept without fail. And now, for the first time, I let myself ask the question I had never dared. What if I stopped? The question sat there, bold, almost sacrilegious. A father doesn't stop providing. That's what I had been taught, what I had lived by. But a man also doesn't keep feeding a fire that burns him. I thought of Margaret again. She would not have been quick to anger, but she would have understood dignity. She believed that giving should never be used as a leash, nor should it be demanded like tribute. Respect first, she always said. Otherwise it isn't love, it's transaction. And wasn't that exactly what I had become? A transaction, a deposit with legs. I pushed the folder away and turned to the computer. The screen glowed pale in the dim room. My hands hovered over the keyboard longer than they should have. I felt like a man about to cross a line he couldn't step back from. Click by click, I navigated to the account. The numbers stared at me, impersonal and exact. Scheduled payments lined up like soldiers ready to march into the next year. My chest tightened as I reached for the mouse. A single option blinked, cancel auto transfer. It was such a small phrase for something that would alter everything. I hesitated. The cursor quivered as my hand trembled. I could almost hear Daniel's voice, not the man he was now, but the boy he had been. "Thanks, Dad." The echoes of those words held me for a moment. Then I heard the other voice, sharper, recent, dismissive. "You're nothing but a walking ATM." I clicked. The screen refreshed. The soldiers vanished. The steady march of numbers dissolved into silence. It was done. I leaned back in the chair, breath shallow. My palms were damp, and yet I felt lighter, as though some invisible yoke had slipped from my shoulders. Fear mingled with relief. What would Daniel say when he noticed? What storm would Isabella unleash? I didn't know. But for once the decision was mine, not theirs. I shut the computer and sat in the quiet, listening to the house breathe around me. The radiator ticked, the fridge hummed, the clock on the wall moved steadily forward. Ordinary sounds, but they felt like witnesses. Later that day, I drove into town. The streets were slushy now, the snow churned by tires and salted into gray puddles. I stopped at a stationery store and bought a new notebook. On its first page, I wrote the date. Beneath it, I wrote a single line: "Today I stopped being their machine." It looked stark on the page, almost defiant, but as I stared at it, I realized I wasn't just recording an act. I was beginning to reclaim a voice. On the way home, I passed their neighborhood. The house was still dressed in Christmas lights, strands of white twinkling against the dusk. I slowed the car, not enough to draw notice, just enough to see shadows moving through the windows. A party still lingering, maybe, or family lingering over leftovers. I drove on without stopping. Back at my own place, I placed the notebook in the drawer where the bank records had been. This, I thought, was the start of something different. Not revenge, not yet. Just a boundary, a line drawn in the snow that no one else could erase. And though the silence of the house pressed in as night fell, for the first time in years it did not feel like punishment. It felt like possibility. The first notice arrived a week later, a polite reminder from the bank, folded neatly in an envelope stamped with their logo. It wasn't even addressed to me, though I had been the one paying. It carried Daniel's name and Isabella's, with my address nowhere in sight. That was fitting, I supposed. In their eyes, my money had never come with a signature. I slipped it back into its envelope and set it on the table. I wasn't ready to face the phone call I knew would follow. And it did 2 days later, on a gray afternoon when the snow outside had hardened into icy ridges. "Dad," Daniel's voice came through, tight with worry. "The bank called. They said the mortgage payment didn't clear." I let the silence hang for a moment. "That's right," I said finally. You didn't." He cut himself off as though the words themselves burned. "No," I answered. "I didn't." On the other end, I heard Isabella's voice, sharp, insistent. She wasn't even trying to lower it. "Ask him why. Ask him if he thinks he can just stop like that. He doesn't get to choose." The words stung, but what came next carved deeper. She must have grabbed the phone, because suddenly her voice was clear, no longer background noise. "Frank," she said, spitting my name like it was something sour, "I don't know what fantasy you're living in, but you can't just pull the rug out from under your own son. Do you know what kind of humiliation you're putting him through? Do you have any idea how this makes us look?" I felt my grip tighten on the receiver. "It seems to me," I said slowly, "that appearances have always mattered more to you than family." A pause, then laughter, not the kind born of humor, but the brittle kind people use when they want to cut. "Family," she repeated. "Your wife is gone, and all you've got left is a checkbook. That's all you've ever had to offer. Without it, you're nothing." I closed my eyes, her words burning through me. Margaret's face rose in my mind, not in grief but in defense. She had been gone for years, yet Isabella wielded her absence like a weapon. That was the final insult. Not the ATM remark, not the banishment from Christmas, but this, the dragging of my wife's memory into their disdain. Something shifted inside me then, a click as certain as the one I had made canceling the payments. I had tried silence. I had tried endurance. But there are insults you do not bear, not when they strike the dead you still love. I steadied my voice. "Put Daniel back on." There was a shuffle, then his hesitant tone. "Dad, listen to me carefully," I said. "I will not pay another cent toward that house. I will not fund the life you let her belittle me in. And if you think you can stand by while she drags your mother's name through the mud, then you've already lost more than any mortgage can cover." He didn't answer. I could hear his breath, uneven, caught between shame and fear. "Do you understand me, Daniel?" I pressed. "Yes," he whispered. I hung up before he could say more. The phone sat heavy in my hand for a long time after, its dial tone humming like a verdict. My chest heaved, not with regret but with the rawness of a wound exposed. I had drawn the line, and now it was real. That evening I opened the drawer where the notebook lay. On the second page, beneath the first declaration, I wrote, "Today she spoke Margaret's name. That was her mistake." My handwriting shook, but the words were steady. This was no longer about money. It was about dignity, about defending what Margaret had meant to me, to us, about refusing to let her memory be twisted into leverage. I sat back, staring at the words. The house was quiet as always, but the quiet no longer felt empty. It felt resolute. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, rattling the panes. It sounded almost like applause, the world at last, bearing witness to a man who had chosen to stand. In the days that followed, I discovered a peculiar kind of calm. Not the peace of resolution, not yet, but the clarity that comes when anger finally sharpens into purpose. For weeks I had carried their words like stones in my chest, weighing me down with shame and doubt. Now those same stones began to stack themselves into something else, a foundation, a wall, a resolve I hadn't felt in years. It began with a box, an old cardboard one I pulled from the attic, the kind that once held Margaret's Christmas decorations. I carried it to the kitchen table and set it down with a thud. One by one I began to fill it: bank statements, canceled checks, receipts from home improvement stores, invoices from contractors whose names I could still recall, men who had shaken my hand, thanked me for prompt payment, and then moved on to their next job. All of it evidence of the years I had poured into that house. I worked slowly, deliberately, as though each slip of paper was a tile in a mosaic. There was something almost sacred about the process. For too long I had treated these documents as mundane, the background noise of life. Now they became something else, a record, a testimony, proof that I had been more than a machine, proof that I had built, supported, carried. The pile grew higher. I found the receipt for the granite counters Isabella had shown off to her guests, calling them our investment. I found the order confirmation for the imported curtain she liked to boast about, as though heritage could be measured in fabric. I found the bill for the stainless steel appliances Daniel had once said he could never afford, appliances that gleamed in every photograph they posted online. I slipped each paper into a clear sleeve, arranging them in a binder I had bought at the office supply store. 12 tabs, one for each category: mortgage, utilities, renovations, furnishings, even the groceries I had often carried through their door. Each page slid into place with a satisfying click, the binder swelling with evidence. At night, when the house grew too quiet, I sat at the table and wrote notes in the margins: dates, amounts, context. I wanted no detail overlooked. If they had turned my life into a ledger, then I would keep the ledger better than they ever imagined. There were moments when I hesitated, when the father in me whispered that this was betrayal, that a parent's sacrifices were never meant to be tallied like debts. But then I remembered Isabella's voice, cold and cutting. "Your wife is gone. Without the checkbook, you're nothing." That voice silenced the doubt. I wasn't keeping score for vengeance. I was building a record because truth had to be preserved, especially when others tried to bury it. The work consumed me. I lost track of hours, of meals. The living room floor became covered with neat stacks of papers, each labeled with sticky notes. The printer hummed as I made copies, not one set but 12. I bought envelopes, heavy manila ones that could withstand handling. Each was marked carefully, as though I were preparing exhibits for a trial. And perhaps I was. On the third evening, I opened a photo album that had sat untouched for years. Between its pages, I found snapshots of the house being built: Daniel in a hard hat I'd borrowed from a friend, me grinning with dust on my face, Margaret holding a tray of sandwiches for the workers. I slipped the photos out and added them to the binder, proof not just of money but of presence, proof that I had stood there from the beginning. By the end of the week, the binders were ready. 12 identical volumes, stacked neatly in the box that had once held holiday ornaments. The irony was not lost on me. Christmas decorations replaced by receipts, the season of family togetherness overshadowed by records of division. I sat back in my chair and looked at them, the weight of 5 years bound in paper and ink. For the first time in a long while I felt prepared. Not safe, not comfortable, but prepared. I knew confrontation would come. Isabella would not accept silence. Daniel would not resist her for long. And when they came for me, when they demanded, accused, belittled, I would no longer answer with words alone. I would answer with evidence. It was a Saturday morning when the phone rang. The sky outside was pale and brittle, the kind of winter morning that felt more like glass than air. I was in the middle of sorting another stack of documents, making sure the dates lined up, when Daniel's number flashed on the screen. I hesitated before answering. I could already imagine Isabella's hand guiding the call, even if Daniel's voice was the one I heard. "Dad," he said with that familiar strain of obligation. "Listen, could you do us a favor? Isabella's parents are flying in this afternoon. Would you mind picking them up at the airport? It'd mean a lot. There it was, the first test. A small request on the surface, nothing unusual about asking a father to lend a hand. But I heard the undertone clearly: we still expect you to play your part. You may have canceled the money, but you'll keep doing the chores. You'll keep showing up when called. I let the silence stretch long enough for him to squirm. Why can't you pick them up yourself? I asked. Well, we're busy preparing the house, the dinner, you know how it is. We want everything perfect when they arrive. Perfect, that word again. It had become their refrain, their shield. Perfect house, perfect image, perfect atmosphere, and my role as always to do the quiet labor that allowed their illusion to shine. I thought of the binders stacked in the box beside me, 12 volumes of truth. I thought of Margaret, who used to say, people show you who they are in small moments before the big ones. This was one of those moments. No, I said simply. There was a pause, startled. No, that's right, I told him. I won't be going. I could hear him covering the phone, muffled voices behind him. Then Isabella's tone cut through, sharper than a blade. What does he mean, no? He doesn't get to just refuse. It's the least he can do. Daniel came back on the line, his words fumbling. Dad, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're counting on you. I felt something inside me harden, not with cruelty, but with resolve. For years I had been the one to smooth things over, to step in, to rescue. And every time I did, I vanished a little more. This was my chance to stop disappearing. I won't be at the airport, I repeated, calm and clear. If you need to greet her parents, then you do it. It's your responsibility, not mine. There was another pause, this one longer, heavier. Finally, Daniel muttered something like agreement, though his voice carried the tremor of a man caught between two worlds. When I hung up, the house seemed to exhale. The quiet felt different now, not empty, but earned. That afternoon, I pictured the scene unfolding without me. Isabella in her tailored coat, glancing at the clock, tapping her heel while Daniel drove through traffic to fetch her parents himself. I imagined her frustration, her whispered accusations, the way she would paint me as unreliable, selfish, ungrateful. Let her. For once, their story would have to spin without me feeding it. Later, I drove to the grocery store. As I walked the aisles, I noticed a lightness in my step. It wasn't joy exactly, but a kind of unburdening. For so long, I had been conditioned to say yes to Ben, to prove my usefulness in silence. Saying no felt like opening a window in a room that had been shut for years. Back home, I sat at the table and added another note to my notebook. Refused the airport. First refusal in years. The words looked stark on the page, but they warmed me. This was how change began, not with grand declarations, but with small defiance, with choosing not to be used. Night came, and with it the expected storm. Daniel called again, his voice tight. They weren't happy, Dad. Isabella's furious. She said you embarrassed us. Embarrassed you? I asked. For staying home while you welcomed your own in-laws. He didn't answer. The silence between us was thick, filled with everything he wanted to say but couldn't. Finally, he muttered, I don't want this to get worse. It's already worse, I said softly. You just haven't admitted it yet. When I set the phone down, I looked over at the box of binders, the envelopes lined like soldiers ready for a march. I had not unveiled them yet, but in my mind I saw the day coming. The first trap had been sprung, small but significant, and the ground beneath their illusion had begun to crack. The first whisper reached me through a neighbor. Mrs. Grant, a kindly widow who walked her dog past my porch every morning, paused one day with a newspaper folded under her arm. Her face carried the cautious sympathy people wear when they aren't sure how much truth you already know. Frank, she said gently, I'm sorry, I thought you should see this. She offered me the paper as though it were an injured bird. I unfolded it slowly, already bracing myself. There, on page 6 of the local section, was a headline that made my chest seize. Elderly man abandons family, leaves son with crushing debt. Beneath it, my name. My story, or at least their version of it, spilled out in black and white. The article painted me as a reckless old man who had promised support, and then cruelly withdrawn it. It spoke of my emotional instability, of erratic behavior that left my son scrambling to protect his young family. Words like irresponsible, unreliable, selfish bled through the column. There were quotes too, anonymous but transparent. It's heartbreaking, one read. Imagine a grandfather refusing to care for his own flesh and blood. Money meant for the home suddenly cut off, right before the holidays. What kind of man does that? I didn't need a byline to know where it had come from. I could hear Isabella's cadence in every phrase. She had taken our private fracture and turned it into spectacle, laundering her disdain into sympathy. And the town, hungry always for drama, for stories that fit neatly into villains and victims, would lap it up. My hands trembled as I set the paper down. The quiet of the kitchen pressed in heavy. For years I had been invisible, tolerated only for the checks I signed. Now, suddenly, I was visible in the worst way, my name dragged through ink, my reputation offered for public judgment. I thought of Margaret again. She had built a life on kindness, on dignity. To see her husband's name tied to cruelty would have broken her heart. For a moment, shame rose hot in my throat. Then anger burned it away. That evening, I spread the newspaper across the table beside my binders. The contrast was almost poetic. Their lies on one side, my truth on the other. Columns of accusation versus pages of evidence. For the first time, I realized just how powerful those binders might be. I began to work with a new urgency. I clipped the article, slid it into a sleeve marked defamation. I pulled out old photographs, receipts with dates that lined up with each payment, proof of every dollar I had provided. I wanted no shadow left for them to twist. The phone rang twice that night. I let it go unanswered. The third time I picked up. "Dad," Daniel's voice weary, "I know you've seen it." "Yes," I said. "I didn't want it to be like this," he murmured. She thought it was the only way people would understand. I closed my eyes. Understand what? That your father became a villain so you could stay comfortable. Silence stretched. Then faintly, "I don't know what to say." "Then don't," I told him. "You've already said enough by staying quiet." I hung up before he could answer. In the days that followed, I felt the subtle shift in town. A clerk at the grocery store avoided my eyes. A man at the gas station gave a long look, then turned away. The poison was working. Reputation in a small community is like water. Once it's tainted, it seeps into every crack. But I was not defeated. Each glance, each whisper only strengthened my resolve. They had chosen the battlefield, public opinion, but they underestimated the arsenal I had quietly built. Late one night, I cleared the dining table completely and laid out the 12 binders in a row. Their spines lined up like soldiers awaiting orders. I opened them one by one, flipping through the neat pages, the receipts, the photographs. Each binder was a voice, calm and undeniable, saying, "This is the truth." I imagined the day I would place them, not in a drawer, not hidden in silence, but directly in the hands of those who mattered, friends, neighbors, colleagues, even the very people who now doubted me. Not shouted, not argued, but presented with the simple power of proof. The smear in print had cut deep, but in cutting, it had also revealed the next step. This was no longer just about refusing to be used. It was about reclaiming the story, about making sure Margaret's memory, my name, and even Daniel's place in it would not be buried under lies. I closed the last binder gently and placed it back into the box. The newspaper lay beside it, crumpled but preserved, like a reminder of the war they had chosen to start. I turned off the light, and in the dark I felt no fear, only readiness. The newspaper had done its work. For days I felt the town's eyes on me. Not openly hostile, not yet, but measured, curious, suspicious. The kind of glances that said, "I read something about you. I wonder if it's true." In a small place like ours, rumor travels faster than snowmelt. I carried myself quietly, going about errands with my head level, never defensive. But the sting was there all the same. It's one thing to be ignored in your own family. It's another to be shamed in front of strangers you've lived among for decades. Then slowly, something unexpected began to happen. The first was Mr. Alvarez, retired mason who lived 2 streets over. I had hired him once years ago to help repair a chimney, and we'd shared beers on my porch afterward. One morning, as I cleared ice from my walkway, he shuffled up with his cane. He leaned close, his voice low but firm. "I saw that article," he said. "Don't you let it crush you. Folks who know what it takes to put bread on the table, we can read between the lines. A man doesn't pay for half a decade without reason." I looked at him, surprised. His eyes were steady, weathered like stone, and for the first time in weeks I felt less alone. Later that same week at the grocery store, the young cashier with the nervous smile, Emily, I think her name was, slipped me an extra paper bag for free. As she handed me my receipt, she whispered, "My dad used to help me too. People don't always appreciate it. I just wanted to say I believe you." It was a small thing, almost nothing. But small kindnesses can be heavier than stones. Word must have spread in quiet circles because soon others appeared. Old friends from the factory, men who'd known me as a steady pair of hands on long shifts, nodded as I passed. A neighbor left a pie on my porch without a note, just the gesture. Even the pastor at the local church stopped me after service, laying a hand on my shoulder. "Frank," he said softly, "sometimes truth walks slower than gossip, but it always arrives. Hold steady." Each of these moments was like a thread stitching back a tear. They didn't erase the damage, but they reminded me that reputation is not built in a single headline. It's built over years of showing up, of work done and debts honored, of children raised and roofs repaired. Still, the louder voices belonged to Isabella. She and her parents moved easily in the circles that thrived on appearances, the country club luncheons, the charity galas. In those rooms, their version of events was gospel. I heard it echoed in passing. Such a shame, abandoning his own son. Their whispers floated through town like smoke. But now at least I had counterweights. Quiet allies who didn't need convincing, who carried in their own memories the truth of who I had been long before Isabella ever arrived. One evening I invited two of them, Mr. Alvarez and an old coworker named Tom, to my house. The binders sat stacked on the table, waiting. I opened them one by one, showing the receipts, the checks, the photographs. Neither man spoke for a long time. They just turned the pages slowly, their fingers tracing the neat rows of numbers. Finally Tom looked up, shaking his head. "Frank, this isn't just generosity. This is half a lifetime's work, and they're smearing you for stopping." "Yes," I said quietly. "They think silence will keep me cornered. They don't know I've been keeping records." Mr. Alvarez tapped the binder. "When the time comes, you put this in front of people. Don't shout. Don't argue. Just let the truth sit there. It'll do the talking." His words sank deep. I realized then that my evidence wasn't just for me. It was for those who still believed in fairness, for those who'd been quiet too long under the weight of appearances. When they left that night, the house didn't feel so empty. The binders no longer looked like lonely stacks of paper, but like ammunition waiting for the right moment. Later, I wrote in the notebook, "Not everyone believes the lies. The truth has allies even if they whisper." For the first time since the insult that started it all, I slept soundly. Not because the battle was over, far from it, but because I knew I would not fight alone. The house grew colder as January settled in, but my kitchen table remained warm with the work of my hands. The binders I had built, once a private exercise in dignity, began to feel like something else altogether. A plan. Every page, every receipt, every photograph was a weapon forged not of anger but of fact. I began to think less like a father wronged and more like a craftsman shaping something to last. Truth, if it was going to survive the weight of lies, needed to be presented with care. Not scattered, not shouted, but bound and undeniable. It started with the printer. Its hum filled the house for days, spitting out duplicates until the air smelled faintly of toner. I copied every bank statement, every invoice, every email confirmation. I wanted 12 sets, one for each guest I imagined around their glittering dining table. If Isabella could turn whispers into ink, then I would turn ink into mirrors, reflections too sharp to ignore. I bought heavy stock paper, the kind that wouldn't curl in nervous hands, and slid each sheet into clear plastic sleeves. I labeled the sections carefully: mortgage, utilities, renovations, furnishings, groceries, miscellaneous. Each binder swelled until it seemed to groan with the weight of 5 years' truth. At night, I practiced in my mind how I would walk into that house, where I would stand, how I would lay the binders on the table, one by one, so that no guest could mistake the intent. Not fury, not vengeance, just the plain, heavy dignity of fact. But I knew facts alone rarely sway hearts. People needed stories. They needed context, a thread to guide them through numbers. So I wrote longhand on yellow legal pads. Short statements, no more than a paragraph each, explaining the circumstances of the payments. On March 15th, $2,800 transferred to cover the mortgage while Daniel's hours at work were cut. On June 3rd, $100 spent on curtains chosen by Isabella. Page after page, I gave the receipts their voice. It was exhausting work, but there was a strange peace in it too. Each entry was a reminder that I had not been invisible. They had tried to erase me, but the proof was here, undeniable, stamped in dates and amounts. Sometimes, as I worked, I would catch myself imagining Margaret at the other end of the table. She would have smiled faintly, approving the orderliness, the clarity. "You were always meticulous," she used to say, teasing me when I lined up tools in the garage. I like to think she would have seen this not as petness, but as protection, not just for me but for the truth itself. When the binders were finished, I bought 12 identical manila envelopes, thick enough to hold the weight without tearing. I slid each binder inside, sealed them, and wrote in black marker across the front, "For your review." I stacked them neatly in the old Christmas box, the same one that had once held ornaments. The irony pressed at me again, but this time I welcomed it. Last Christmas they had shut me out. The next time they host a full house, I would step through their doors carrying not gifts wrapped in ribbon but receipts bound in truth. Still, preparation wasn't only about paper. It was about the man who would deliver it. I practiced my breathing, steadying myself against the imagined chorus of outrage, the accusations, the raised voices. I knew Isabella would try to spin, to sneer, to turn even the evidence into another act of manipulation. I could almost hear her voice. "These are exaggerations, he's twisting the story." But the beauty of facts is that they require no performance. They simply sit there, undeniable. My role would not be to argue, but to place the evidence gently in their hands and let silence do the work. One evening, Tom stopped by again. He found me at the table, the envelopes laid out like soldiers ready for inspection. He whistled low. "You're really doing it?" "Yes," I said. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Don't rush it. Wait for the right moment. Make sure it lands when it matters most." I already knew when that would be. A dinner. A gathering. A room full of the very people Isabella wanted to impress. The same stage she had used to exile me, to paint me as unworthy. That would be the place to reveal the truth. After he left, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the envelopes. The house was silent, but for the first time in a long time I didn't mind the silence. It felt like the pause before a storm, the breath drawn before a word is spoken that cannot be unsaid. I rose, carried the box to the closet, and slid it onto the top shelf. Then I stood there for a long time, the closet door open, the box staring back at me. My hands ached from the hours of work, but inside me, something steadier had taken root. The stage was set. The binders were ready. All that remained was the moment itself. The night air was sharp as glass when I pulled into their neighborhood. Snow crunched beneath the tires, muffling the hum of the engine. Lights blazed from every house on the block, wreaths and ribbons catching the glow like jewels. Their home shone brightest of all, strings of white bulbs tracing every roofline, a tall window glowing warmly with the silhouettes of guests inside. I sat for a moment in the truck, watching the shapes move within. Laughter drifted faintly even through the glass. It should have hurt, that sound, but instead it steadied me. They had turned my absence into routine, had carved me out of the picture. Tonight I would step back in, not to beg for a place, but to reclaim the truth. The box of envelopes rested on the seat beside me. 12 packets, identical, silent, waiting. I lifted it carefully, as though carrying something fragile, and walked to the door. Inside, the party was already in full swing. Guests clustered in the foyer, coats draped over arms, voices warm with wine. I stepped through the doorway unannounced, the cold following me in like an unwelcome companion. Heads turned, conversations faltered. Daniel froze near the fireplace, a glass in his hand. His eyes widened when he saw me. Isabella stood at his side, elegant in a red dress that caught the light, her smile faltering into something harder. "Dad," Daniel said, his voice breaking just slightly. We didn't expect you." "I know," I said, setting the box down on a side table. "But I came anyway." Isabella's lips tightened. "This isn't the time." "On the contrary," I answered, pulling out the first envelope. "It's exactly the time." The room had quieted now, the guests watching with the kind of curiosity people can't help but feel when a scene unfolds in front of them. I took one envelope and placed it in the hands of a woman standing nearby. Then another and another, passing them out like communion. Murmurs rippled as each guest opened the flap and slid out the thick binder. "What is this?" one of them asked, flipping through pages. "Evidence," I said simply. 5 years of it. Every mortgage payment, every bill, every renovation, every purchase, paid by me, quietly, faithfully, without thanks. Gasps fluttered through the crowd as the pages turned. Numbers, receipts, photographs. The story of a house built not just on ambition but on sacrifice. Isabella stepped forward, her voice sharp. "This is ridiculous. He's exaggerating. He's twisting everything." "No," a guest interrupted, holding up a page. "These are bank statements, official records." Another voice, "That's his name on the checks." The weight of truth spread from envelope to envelope until the room seemed to lean with it. Isabella's face flushed, her composure cracking. Daniel stood frozen, caught between shame and disbelief, his hand trembling as he opened his own binder. I looked directly at him. "I didn't do this to humiliate you. I did it because lies were printed about me. Lies you allowed, tonight, in front of your friends, your family, the people whose respect you value so much. I'm setting the record straight." For a long moment no one moved. Only the rustle of turning pages filled the silence. Finally, an older man near the end of the table, one of Isabella's uncles perhaps, cleared his throat. "You mean to say all this time, this house, this life was paid for by him?" He gestured toward me. Daniel lowered his head. His lips parted, but no words came. "Yes," Isabella snapped. "But that doesn't excuse him cutting us off without warning. Who does that to their own child?" I met her gaze steadily. "A father who refuses to be treated as a machine. A man whose wife's memory was insulted. A human being with limits." The silence after that was heavier than any argument. Even the children, sensing the shift, quieted. One by one the guests closed their binders, some with careful respect, others with barely concealed shock. The illusion of Isabella's perfect world had cracked wide open, and there was no patching it in that moment. I gathered the empty box, leaving the binders in their hands. "Keep them," I said. "Read them, decide for yourselves who I am." Then I turned and walked toward the door. No one stopped me. The murmur of voices rose behind me, fractured, uncertain. But I didn't need to hear their conclusions. The truth was no longer locked in my drawer. It was out in the world, undeniable. The cold air met me like an old friend as I stepped outside. Snow fell lightly, dusting my shoulders, the night sky wide and silent above. For the first time in years I felt taller, as though a weight had lifted from my spine. I drove home slowly, headlights carving tunnels through the dark. The roads were empty, but my heart was full with something I hadn't known in a long while. The quiet satisfaction of a man who has finally spoken, not in anger, but in truth. The morning after the dinner, the phone rang twice before I answered. My hands were still stiff from shoveling the night's snow, and my voice was low, steady when I said hello. On the other end, Daniel's breath carried a weight I had never heard before. "Dad," he said. Just that one word, strained as if his throat had turned against him. I waited. "They're furious," he continued. "Her parents, Isabella, everyone. They said you humiliated us, that you ruined our dinner." His words tumbled out like broken glass, cutting him as much as they cut me. "I didn't ruin it," I said softly. "I revealed it." He fell silent. In that pause I imagined him gripping the phone with both hands, searching for words that could bridge the canyon opening between us. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "The guests, they kept asking questions, even after you left. They wanted to know why I never said anything, why I let them believe the wrong story. I didn't have an answer, Dad. The truth was out and it had found its own legs. That was the reckoning I knew would come, not just for Isabella but for Daniel too. He had chosen silence all these years, and now that silence was louder than any accusation. That day, whispers ran through the town again, but they sounded different. At the grocery store, I caught fragments. "Did you see those binders? Every receipt." At the gas station, "He kept the lights on," and they called him selfish. The smear that had stained me only a week earlier was being washed away, replaced by something sturdier. Even Mrs. Grant stopped by, her dog tugging at the leash, a smile twitching at her lips. "I heard about that dinner," she said. "Good for you, Frank. Some truths deserve the light of day." But not everyone was ready to shift. Isabella doubled down, spinning the narrative in every circle she could. "He ambushed us," she told anyone who would listen. "He embarrassed the family, used numbers to manipulate sympathy. Who does that to their own son?" Yet the binders had done their work. People had seen with their own eyes, and once seen, truth cannot be unseen. A few nights later, Daniel came to my door. The snow was falling hard, dusting his coat and hair. He stood in the glow of the porch light, shoulders hunched, eyes rimmed red. I opened the door without a word. He stepped inside. stamping snow from his boots. For a long moment we just stood there in the quiet of my living room, the radiator ticking faintly in the corner. "I don't know how to fix this," he said finally, his voice raw. "Fix what?" I asked. "Everything," he whispered. "The house, Isabella, the lies, you and me." He dropped his gaze, ashamed. "I let her run over you. I let her talk about Mom like that. I thought keeping peace was the same as keeping family, but it wasn't peace. It was cowardice." Hearing him say those words was like a weight lifting from my chest and pressing into his. He carried now what I had carried alone for years. I poured us both coffee, black and steaming. We sat at the table where I had assembled the binders, the ghost of their presence still heavy in the room. "You don't have to fix everything tonight," I told him, "but you have to decide who you are, not who she tells you to be, not who her parents want you to be. You." He nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "I don't know if I can." "You can," I said, "but it'll cost you. Truth always does." For the first time in years he reached across the table, his hand finding mine. It was tentative, almost boyish, but real. When he left that night, I watched him walk down the drive, his figure blurred by snow. I didn't know what choices he would make, but I knew something had cracked open in him, the same way it had cracked open for me weeks earlier when I clicked cancel auto transfer. The reckoning had begun. Not mine, not anymore. His. And as I closed the door, I felt the house settle around me, not empty this time, but waiting. It was late February when the cracks in their perfect facade began to show. Winter was loosening its grip, the icicles dripping one steady drop at a time, but inside Daniel's world the freeze was only tightening. I learned of it not from him at first, but from the envelope he carried when he finally came to my door. He stood there in the fading light, his face pale, a thin slip of paper trembling in his hand. "Dad," he said quietly, "they sent us this." He laid it on the kitchen table. A notice of default, the kind of document that stripped away all pretenses with the blunt force of numbers and deadlines. The bank didn't care about atmospheres or appearances. It cared only about the missing payments stacked one atop another. I read it once, then again. The words were cold but precise. Failure to remit, action required, foreclosure proceedings pending. I had seen enough contracts in my life to know the gravity of what lay between the lines. 3 months, Daniel whispered. "We're already 3 months behind." I lifted my eyes to his. He looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of the house itself were pressing down on his shoulders. "Did Isabella know this was coming?" I asked. He swallowed hard. "She thought we could manage. Her parents, they promised to help, but they haven't. They just said to hold out until spring, that things would settle. Now it's too late." I leaned back, the radiator hissing softly beside us. "Silence is expensive, son. It always has been. You thought staying quiet kept the peace, but it only delayed the storm." He rubbed his temples, eyes wet. "I wanted to believe if I said nothing, if I just went along, it would work itself out. But now we could lose the house." The house. The symbol of all their pride, all their posturing, all the sacrifices buried beneath polished floors and shining appliances. I had built it with my labor, supported it with my wages, and been cast out of it by the very people who lived within its walls. And now, without the quiet drip of my transfers, it stood on the brink of collapse. For a long while neither of us spoke. The only sound was the steady tick of the clock above the sink. Finally, I pushed the notice back across the table. "This is yours to face," I said gently. "Not out of cruelty, out of truth. You wanted independence. This is what it costs." His hands closed around the paper, knuckles white. "I don't know how to tell her," he whispered. "You don't," I replied. "You show her, let the letter speak. She can't charm her way out of this. No headline, no party, no smile will erase these numbers." He nodded, but his face carried the hollow look of a man seeing the edge of a cliff for the first time. In the days that followed, I heard whispers ripple through town again. Guests from that Christmas dinner had begun to speak, cautiously at first, then louder. Stories of Isabella's extravagance, of unpaid vendors, of a woman who spun images of wealth while debts piled unseen. Reputation, once her greatest armor, began to turn brittle. I walked to the post office one afternoon and overheard 2 clerks talking near the counter. "I heard the Carlyle's daughter's place is in trouble," one said. "Funny, after all that boasting." They caught sight of me and fell silent, but the damage was already done. Gossip had shifted sides. Daniel came to me again the next week, hollow-eyed and sleepless. "She's angry," he confessed. Angrier than I've ever seen her, she says you cursed us, that you wanted this to happen. I shook my head slowly. I didn't curse you, son. I warned you. There's a difference. He dropped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. I don't know if we can survive this. Not the house, not the marriage. I watched him, my heart torn. I wanted to reach across, to rescue him as I had so many times before. But I knew if I did, the cycle would only repeat. Love had its limits, and enabling was not the same as saving. The notice sat between us, stark and unyielding. A reminder that silence, when chosen over truth, always collects its toll. And this time the toll was not mine to pay. Outside, the snow melted in slow rivulets, running along the curb, carrying away the grime of winter. But in that kitchen, the thaw had not yet reached. Daniel sat motionless, the paper clutched in his hand, the weight of consequence pressing heavier than any storm. And for the first time, I let it stay there. It was March when Daniel returned, not with papers in his hand this time, but with something heavier etched into his face. Regret. He stood on my porch in the cool dusk, shoulders sagging as though the weight of the house, the debts, and the silence had finally collapsed upon him. When I opened the door, he didn't speak right away. He stepped inside, removing his coat slowly, eyes darting around the room as if searching for a version of home he had forgotten. The familiar creak of the floorboard seemed to unsettle him. For years he had walked across polished hardwoods, rugs chosen for appearance, lights set for ambience. Here things were plain, but they were honest. "Dad," he said finally, his voice low and unsteady. "I need to say something I should have said a long time ago." I gestured to the chair at the kitchen table. He sat down, his hands clasped so tightly they trembled. I poured coffee into 2 mugs, though neither of us touched it. He stared at his fingers as he spoke. "I let you down. I let Mom down. I let myself down. I let her voice drown out yours. Every time you tried to show me, every time you bore the weight for me, I told myself I was just keeping peace, but I wasn't. I was choosing the easy way because I was afraid to stand against her, afraid to admit that without you we couldn't keep that house standing." I listened, saying nothing, letting the words fall like stones he had been carrying too long. "I should have defended you," he continued, his voice cracked now, sharp and raw. "When she called you an ATM, when she said you were nothing without money, when she dragged Mom's name into it." He swallowed hard, tears glinting in his eyes. "I should have stopped it, but I didn't. And now the house is slipping away and the marriage might too. And all I can think about is how much I betrayed the man who gave me everything." The room was quiet except for the faint hiss of the radiator. I studied him, this grown man who was still my boy. The lines around his eyes were deeper now, his hair thinner at the temples. He was no longer the child who once pressed coins into my palm, but in that moment he looked just as fragile. "I'm not here to ask you to fix it," he whispered. "Not the house, not the mortgage, not the mess. I know that's mine to face now. I'm here because I need to know if you can forgive me. Not for the money, but for the silence, for letting her erase you, for letting her erase Mom." My throat tightened. Forgiveness is a strange thing. It isn't a gift we give once wrapped and delivered. It is something we choose again and again, even as the wound throbs beneath the scar. I reached across the table, laying my hand over his. His fingers gripped mine with desperate strength. "Daniel," I said softly, "I never needed your defense in the papers. I never needed you to shout my name in the streets. I needed your respect. I needed your voice when she tried to strip me down to nothing. That's what hurt, not the mortgage, not the house, the silence." His shoulders shook as he bowed his head. "I know," he whispered, "and I'm sorry." For a long time we sat like that, father and son, the years of unspoken words pressing between us. The coffee cooled untouched. Outside, the last light of day faded into the quiet dark. Finally, I let out a long breath. "I forgive you," I said. "Not because the hurt is gone, but because I don't want it to own me anymore. And because you're still my son, that hasn't changed." His sob was quiet, muffled into the back of his hand. He wasn't a boy anymore, but grief makes children of us all. We didn't talk about the future of his marriage that night, or the looming foreclosure, or the gossip that still hung in the air. Those were storms he would have to navigate himself. But something in him shifted as he rose to leave, his shoulders straighter, his gaze clearer. At the door, he turned back. "Dad," he said, voice steady now, "thank you for forgiving me, for everything." When the door closed and the night air swept in, I stood alone in the quiet house. My chest felt lighter, not because the past had been erased, but because the present had been reclaimed. For years, I had been treated as less than a man, less than a father. But in that moment, hearing my son's apology, I felt both again. Not because of money or binders or evidence, but because the truth had finally been spoken between us. And that truth, fragile as it was enough. Spring came slowly that year, hesitant after such a long winter. The snow melted in small patches first, leaving the earth damp and brown before the grass dared to return. The streets filled with the sound of dripping gutters, children on bicycles, neighbors shaking off months of hibernation. And in that thaw I felt something thaw inside me too. The storm had passed, though its debris still lingered. Daniel and Isabella's house carried the weight of default, each letter from the bank a reminder that marble countertops and imported curtains could not cover cracks in a foundation of contempt. Their marriage hung in silence, fraying at the edges. I no longer lived inside that tension. It wasn't my fight to manage anymore, and that freedom was its own kind of grace. I spent my mornings differently now. Instead of driving into town with worry clenched in my chest, I brewed coffee and sat on the porch swing Margaret and I had built years ago. I listened to the birds return, their songs tentative but insistent. I let the air fill my lungs without hurry. My hands no longer shook with anger, and my nights no longer replayed insults on loop. One evening, Daniel came again. His visits had grown more frequent since the apology. He arrived alone this time, without papers, without shadows clinging to his voice. He simply sat across from me, the chair creaking beneath him, and spoke like the son I remembered. "Dad," he said, "I don't know what comes next for us. Not with the house, not with her, but I know what I want with you. I don't want to lose this again." I looked at him, really looked at the tired lines under his eyes, at the way his hands rested openly on the table. And for the first time in years, I saw not a boy hiding behind silence, not a man bent under someone else's weight, but my son stripped of pretense. "You won't," I told him, and it was true. Whatever storms awaited him, he would face them now with his own spine, his own choices. My role was no longer to shield him from consequence, but to walk beside him when he asked, to remind him that love endures beyond debt. As weeks passed, I began to release more than just anger. I cleaned the closets, gathering boxes of things that no longer served me. Margaret's dresses, folded carefully and given to charity. Old tools I'd kept just in case, passed on to neighbors who needed them more. Each act felt like unburdening, like loosening the straps of a heavy pack I'd carried too long. One afternoon, I opened the drawer where my notebook lay. Its pages were filled with dates, amounts, notes of pain, and small triumphs. I flipped through them slowly, then closed the cover. I didn't need to write there anymore. The story had reached its ending, not in the way I once imagined, but in the way it was meant to. I carried the notebook out to the backyard. Air was warm, the soil soft with new grass pushing through. I set a small fire in the metal barrel I used for kindling, and I fed the notebook to the flame. The pages curled, blackened, lifted into smoke. I watched them rise until nothing but ash remained. It wasn't erasure. The truth still lived in me, in the binders tucked away, in the lessons learned. But I no longer needed the daily record of wounds. Letting go was not forgetting. It was releasing the grip they had on me. That night I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the bottle Margaret had bought me years ago but I had never opened. I sat by the window as dusk fell, the glass catching the last orange light. I raised it, not in bitterness but in gratitude, to Margaret, to the years we had shared, to the strength she had left me with. To dignity, I whispered. To release. The whiskey burned going down, but it warmed me all the same. As the days grew longer, I noticed something else shift. People in town began to greet me differently. Not with pity, not with suspicion, but with respect. A nod at the post office, a handshake at the hardware store, a simple, "Good to see you, Frank," that carried more weight than they knew. I had been smeared in print, mocked in whispers, cast out of my own family's table. But in the end, the truth had walked steadily, arriving in its own time. And when it did, it restored what mattered most. Not money, not property, but my place as a man who had given, who had endured, and who had chosen at last to stand. Daniel and I never spoke much about the binders again. They remained in the closet, tucked safely away, their edges worn from use. They had served their purpose. What mattered now was the quiet between us, no longer silence born of fear, but silence that allowed space for love to grow back. Sometimes my grandson came to visit. He'd sit on the porch swing with me, legs too short to touch the ground, and ask questions about when his father was a boy. I told him stories about baseball games, about late-night pancakes, about the way his grandmother hummed lullabies. I never spoke of mortgages or receipts. Those were not his burdens. His inheritance would be memory, not debt. And so, in the end, I found release. Not in winning, not in revenge, but in letting go. The house may fall, the marriage may fray, but the truth had been spoken and dignity had been restored. That was enough. I looked out over the town one evening as spring bloomed in earnest, the hills turning green, the sky wide and forgiving. My heart was lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, I no longer felt like a man excluded from a table. I felt like a man who had built his own, steady and strong, and who welcomed whoever chose to sit with respect. And that, at last, was peace. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched you, if you saw something of your own struggles or family in these words, I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, and share this with someone who might need to hear it. I wish you health, peace, and the warmth of family that honors you. May your days be filled with dignity, love, and release.